Well, this is a very basic, of course, and a very broad question. So it might be better if we take it in parts. Let us first focus on the targets that have been set by the International Monetary Fund, because Pakistan, as you know, is in a 3-year extended fund facility with the IMF. And the good news is that only a few days ago, Pakistan's first review was approved by the executive board of the IMF, and Pakistan is about to receive $1 billion as part of the loan amount, which is total of $7 billion. Now, what is significant is that along with the news item in the IMF website, they have also given the new targets for the coming financial year. And in particular, what is very important are the public finance or the budgetary targets. And we need to focus on that because they do represent some change from the original targets that were set in September 2024 when the program was first launched. Let me first highlight some of the macroeconomic changes in the projections. The first projection is that IMF now, unfortunately, thinks that Pakistan's growth dynamism is not as good as it was originally thought it might be. So for this year, for example, 2024-25, IMF is expecting that originally the growth rate would have been 3.2%, but now they've brought it down to 2.6%. But even that looks a bit ambitious because in the first quarter, we did only 1%. The reason why growth is not taking place is because investment has plummeted to a historically low level. You'll be amazed. The level of investment in industry in Pakistan last year was lower than the level of investment 25 years ago. That is the extent to which investment has plummeted. And for growth to rise significantly, you need to have new capacity. It appears that the private sector has withdrawn from industry, and a much larger share of private investment is going to housing, real estate. But that is very unproductive because it does not contribute to exports, or in fact, it leads to more imports because we have to import building materials. So altogether, you look at industry, the growth rate is minus 3%. So Pakistan's growth rate has plummeted. And this year, you will have a further problem with the growth rate negative in agriculture because cotton crop is low by almost 30%. So the IMF has been compelled to downwardly revise the growth rate projection for this year from 3.2 to 2.6. My own assessment is that we'll be lucky if it gets up to 2. Next year, coming year, 2025-26, the original target that the IMF had set was 4.0%, which is a good, reasonable, moderate growth rate. And we haven't attained it for some time. Unfortunately, IMF thinks that next year also there'll be a shortfall. And optimistically, it expects the growth rate to rise, however, from 2.6 to 3.6%. So this is the story behind the projections for next year. And let me very quickly take you through the inflation projections. The rate of inflation. Earlier into this current year, IMF had expected the average inflation to be 9.5%. It's turned out to be much, much less. In fact, last month, if you remember, it was hardly almost 0%. So the IMF has revised the rate of inflation projection for this year quite drastically from 9.5 to 5% only. And next year, they are keeping their inflation projection more or less the same at 7.7%. Even that is low given what's been happening the last few years. This is the story behind the macroeconomic projections, and these influence clearly your public finance and balance of payments projections. The position now is that Pakistan's budgetary provisions for defense will need to be upped significantly as a precautionary move. And interestingly, the IMF has, not because they want to allow this or incorporate this, but it's very interesting that rather coincidentally, not intentionally, the IMF has raised the budget deficit target for next year from 4.7% of the GDP to 5.1% of the GDP. This provides for some extra expenditure, and in our case, we may argue that we will probably have, for precaution purposes, raise the defense budget allocation somewhat. There were every year, last few years, we have compromised on the development budget. And this year, in fact, the federal development budget is hardly 40 to 45% of the target will have been met. So the primary adjustment mechanism to ensure that the deficit target does not get violated too much has been, you're absolutely right, development budget. And that is yet another reason why the growth rate has plummeted, GDP growth rate, because if you don't invest in infrastructure, how can you get growth? Mm-hmm. So you're absolutely right that there is a risk next year that we may see a flattening further of the expenditure on development. I hope that does not happen, and that we do see the beginnings of some revival of public spending on infrastructure projects. You see, the basic problem is the perception of risk and uncertainty. And unfortunately, I have to say this, that risk and uncertainty has increased over the last few years. First, we had COVID, then we had the floods, and now more recently, we have had the security issues. So the end result has been that the private sector has been reluctant to invest. And you know, the level of investment, as I said at the beginning of our session, in the case of industry, investment in industry is the lowest in the last 25 years. This is so unfortunate. What is happening is that the government has brought down the expectations in terms of the fiscal side, as well as the State Bank of Pakistan has followed a fairly aggressive monetary policy. And as you know, recently, the policy rate has been brought down to only 11%. At the start of the year, it was in the late teens. So there has been a big adjustment downwards in the interest rates, and that has led to some increase in credit to the private sector. It was negative last year up till the end of March. This year, the amount of credit that has gone to the private sector is close to 500 billion. That is still a small amount, but at least it is a positive and the beginnings of an increase. Because if you remember, by the end of 23 fiscal year, our reserves had fallen to only $4 billion. We were on the verge of, unfortunately, defaulting. And so there was no other option but to prevent this repatriation of profits. However, this year, the government has been more liberal in terms of the interest rate payments, and certainly the State Bank has encouraged and allowed significant profit repatriation. So in that sense, the numbers look better, and the basic reason why we have been able to do this positive move is because our remittances have gone up by 33%. Historical achievement. Never have we seen such a phenomenal increase. And by the end of the year, inshallah, our remittances will have increased by almost $9 billion. And that is what is providing the liquidity for us to remit more profits, for us to allow somewhat more imports, and to make proper interest payments. This year's budget, there was a plethora of tax measures, and a few of them are ones which I kind of feel were sending the wrong incentive messages. The most important of which is, when I was the finance minister many years ago, I had arranged for exporters to be charged a nominal tax of 1% on their total export income, 1% fixed tax. And that remained valid till this year. In this year's budget, they have withdrawn that 1% nominal tax, withholding tax, and converted it into a full tax liability of exporters. So now there is no difference between an exporter and a domestic producer. All over the world, incentives are given to exports. Pakistan has withdrawn most of its incentives, which I think is a fundamentally wrong policy. And on top of that, the State Bank of Pakistan has somehow or the other managed to fix the exchange rate, literally fix it. It hasn't changed even nominally significantly in the last more than 1 year. And in real terms, our currency is overvalued by over 7 to 8%. We should be giving the proper exchange rate to our exporters so that they can be competitive. So our export promotion policies, unfortunately, have not been working, and we have withdrawn whatever incentives we had in the past. And there was a time when our imports went up to $72 billion. Now they're down to the mid-50s. And clearly that is not because prices have gone down dramatically, but because physical restrictions have been imposed. And you're absolutely right, imports of cars at one stage were down 30% through physical limitations. But the problem historically has been that Pakistan's tax to GDP ratio has been one of the lowest. I mean, just compare two countries, India and Pakistan. Pakistan's tax to GDP ratio last year was 10.5% of the GDP. India is 18% of the GDP. And that is why India's defense budget, even though it's a much bigger country, but their defense budget is vastly bigger than Pakistan. Now, Pakistan does not have the slack of getting a reduction in the tax to GDP, but you're absolutely right. What Pakistan needs to do is that the existing sectors are overtaxed. And the two best examples of overtaxation are salaried taxpayers and corporate taxpayers. What we need to do is to bring down those tax rates to more reasonable and fair treatment, and go for taxing the undertaxed sectors. And the three prime examples of the undertaxed sectors: the number one, agricultural income. Although in Pakistan, just 1% of the big farmers own 22% of the land. So they're all making big incomes, the top landlord community. Then we need to tax the big retailers who are also making a lot of money but engage in massive tax evasion. And the third grossly undertaxed sector is property. You'll be amazed that we don't even have a simple property tax through which we can finance the cities of Pakistan. Karachi is in a mess because it does not have access to the revenues from an urban immovable property tax. So the strategy in this budget, I hope, will be to bring down rates on overtaxed sectors and broad-base the tax system dramatically so that the tax to GDP ratio can actually begin to increase. My own estimate is that the margin that exists and what we call the tax gap is almost 4% of the GDP. So our tax to GDP ratio can go up from 10.5 to 14. And if we go up to 14, then we can spend much more on social protection, much more on education, and much more on health. Therefore, to start off with, the best example is agricultural income tax. As I told you, only 1% of the farmers own 22% of the land, and 5% of the top farmers, own 35% of the land. Fortunately, under IMF pressure, because the first time ever the IMF is insisting on agricultural income tax, now they have passed the new legislation, the 4 provinces. The new agricultural income tax has been brought in, They were supposed to have implemented it and started the taxation from the 1st of January, but they did not do that. They have made a commitment that given the new acts, they will start the taxation from the 1st of July this year. So let's see what happens. The point is, we have historically had a separation between what we call the finance division and the revenue division. The revenue division has really never been allowed to function independently. And in the absence of that function, revenue division was the body which was supposed to decide on tax policy. And FBR was supposed to be regulated by it. But the revenue division did not function. And my own suspicion is that the tax policy office will only be a small part of what otherwise should have been a strong operative revenue division. First, we have to now make the taxation of salaried income. The point is, look at the unreasonableness that a person who's earning only 50,000 rupees a month, and today, you know what the minimum wage is in Pakistan? 37,000 rupees. So a person who's only marginally earning more than the minimum income is being made to pay income tax. So the first thing we need to do is to raise substantially, probably double the exemption limit from 600,000 rupees a year to 1.2 million rupees a year. That would be reasonable. And then have 5 slabs, eventually leading to the maximum marginal rate of 30 to 35%. This is all that we need to do. And the other incentive I would like to provide is to promote savings, because if we have more savings, we'll have more investment and return back to what we used to have in the 90s, and people like me had developed it, is the concept of an investment allowance. So if a salaried person invests, say, a maximum of 15% in approved investments, that is exempt from tax. That will provide a big incentive for savings and promote more investment. But as it turns out, this year, the salaried community is contributing 350 billion rupees extra revenue. So you can imagine how much extra load our salaried community has been carrying. If you were to bring in investment allowance, then we should be, you see, investment allowance will go into government paper, like defense savings certificates and so on. So it will make access to government to savings much cheaper. So we may lose some revenue that way in terms of the allowance, but we will gain in terms of access to savings by the government. Therefore, my own assessment is, if we were to bring in investment allowance and to go for an exemption limit of 1.2 million rupees per annum, then probably we could bring about a savings of 15 to 20%, depending on the income level of the individual. And the amount of the tax evasion in the cigarette sector is close to 300 to 350 billion rupees. And the simplest device which other countries have used for the last many years is a proper track and trace system. Pakistan should implement it with priority, and inshallah we'll pick up a lot of the revenues. We have a tax policy office. This is the market test. Will they be able to ensure improvements in the quality of tax administration along with the policy? We need to see the revenue division becoming far more active and ensuring that the FBR management adheres to well-defined reform principles and measures.